Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you that are on the webinar, and for those of you who may be viewing this as a recording on YouTube, we're right in the middle of harvest in South Texas, so I'm not surprised that we don't have a tremendous amount of people on here, but I'm sure that there'll be a lot of folks that watch this when they get time later in the day. I appreciate you joining us on our weather outlook that's with Jeff Lindner, our meteorologist that works for Harris County Flood Control in Houston. And this is hosted by South Texas Cotton and Grain Association. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and look forward to your report.
Thank you. Thank you for having me this morning. And yeah, we're going to take a look at the weather outlook for the rest of July and then through September. And then we'll focus on the end of the year as we get a little bit later. And we're also going to take a look at this year's hurricane season as we go forward here. Let's see if I can get this to advance. There we go. All right, so this is the rainfall departures from normal. Interestingly enough, we kind of have this band across south central into southeast Texas, where we've had some decent amounts of rain, above average rainfall, if you will, kind of along and north of the US 59 corridor there, from around Victoria up through the southeast part of southeast Texas. And then above average rainfall down in deep South Texas. And again, this goes from the start of the year through the current date. And then about near normal or a little bit below normal along the coastal plains, especially there in Matagorda and Missouri counties, a little bit below normal. A lot of that has been recently, and that's what I'll show here coming up. After we talk about the Gulf water temperature. So this is the Gulf of Mexico water temperatures. The kind of pinkish line is the average 1991 to 2020. So you can kind of see the average there. And then you can see the last several years from 1981 to 2023. And so you can see 2023 has been above average sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico from the start of the year until now. And so you can see at this point at the end there, the Gulf is running about as hot as we've ever seen at this time of year. And this is really what is leading to the persistent warmth in the overnight hours, especially along the coast. Overnight lows in the low to mid 80s night after night after night. And also these very high heat index values during the afternoon. And so, you know, it's one thing to get a heat advisory in South Texas. It's another thing to get day after day after day of excessive heat warnings, and that's heat index of 115 or greater, at least for a couple of hours, and at least more than just an isolated location. And so, you know, a lot of this is because of the very warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, especially those nearshore waters. There's some water temperatures in the Laguna Madre that are up into the lower 90s. And so that persistent south and southeast wind blowing across those warm waters is just really holding up the overnight low temperatures. And in the afternoon, the dew point or the moisture that's in the atmosphere, especially near the coastal plain, is not able to mix out and lower. Typically low mid 70s on a summer afternoon in South Texas, but it's persistent this summer. Dew points in the upper 70s, maybe even around 80 or the lower 80s, especially around the Corpus Christi and Kingsville area. That area has been really warm with respect to the dew points. And so that is what is leading to these high afternoon heat index values. It's not necessarily the temperatures themselves or anything we haven't seen. You know, hitting 100 or 105 in South Texas in the summer is not that unusual, but the dew points not lowering during the afternoon is unusual. And that is leading to these very high values. And so that's why we keep seeing these day after day after day of these excessive heat warnings and heat advisories. And it's really a function of the Gulf. And so I don't know if we'll see a lot of change for the rest of this summer until we can cool down the water temperature some in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, so I wanted to go through the drought outlook and kind of show where we were, where we have been, and where we're at now. So this is March, before we started getting some rains in April and May in South Texas. So drought was kind of developing across South Texas, and of course was already ongoing across Central Texas. And then we got all that rain, especially in May and early June, and we had complete removal of drought pretty much everywhere in South Texas, the coastal plain, coastal bend, and even back in the Rio Grande Valley, and and decent improvement even in Central Texas. But sure enough, with the high pressure over us, the very warm conditions, drought has slowly started to creep back in here over the last couple of weeks. So this is as of last week, July the 4th, and you can see the majority of the area is in what we call abnormally dry. So this isn't necessarily drought conditions, but it is starting to get dry from Matagorda County up into Brazoria County. Those locations are in a moderate drought. And again, a lot of this is because the last part of June and the first part of July, we really did not see a whole lot of rainfall in those locations. And typically, your coastal locations in the summer months are where you do see a majority of your rainfall. So typically we get the sea breeze, we get the showers and thunderstorms that develop near the coast in the late morning, early afternoon, and then they move inland a county or two, and then they dissipate in the evening. And so inland areas don't see a whole lot of rain this time of year. Coastal areas tend to get at least some scattered stuff, and we really haven't seen much of that at all this year, except last week. We did see some showers and thunderstorms, especially in the coastal bend area. With that tropical wave and trough that was sitting off the coast. And that was almost a little bit of a normal summer pattern for us. And then, of course, the ridge of high pressure has built back in this week, and it really looks to stay through the end of July, probably across much of South Texas. So I think we're going to see the drought conditions degrade some. The difference between this and say 1980 or 2011 is that the vegetation for the most part is still pretty green in most of the area. The soil, while it is drying out, it is not overly dry. And so it's this ridge of high pressure, which had kind of formed in northeast Mexico and western South Texas in June, has not really gained a foothold over us. So the center of this high has shifted back out towards Arizona and New Mexico, and it kind of branches back into Texas, but the center is not sitting over Texas. And so while it's hot and humid and all that and dry, we were still able to get some showers last week. And even next week, the high is a little bit a little bit further to the north, and it may allow some of that more typical sea breeze stuff, very isolated along the coast. And so we're certainly not looking at a 1980 or 2011, even though we're seeing some drought kind of creep back in to portions of South Texas. This kind of shows, and I think this is maybe a little bit worse than it comes out to looking here. So these are the fire index values, and they also can tell you how deep the moisture is or how dry it is in the soil. And so 0 is the surface and 800 is 8 inches deep, and so every inch equals 100 value on this chart. And so anything that's in blue, the soil is relatively wet, and you can see it's really hit and miss, which is what we've seen with the showers and thunderstorms. Some areas, southern Calhoun County, areas west of the Corpus Christi area, north of Brownsville, south of Kingsville, those areas have had some decent rains over the last week, and so their values are very low, and things are probably pretty well there. And then you have other areas very close nearby that have values are 600 or 700, and so it's just that scattered nature this time of year of the rainfall. And so some areas can get a lot of relief, and other areas continue to be very dry. But you can see, generally speaking, the average is somewhere between about 300-400 and 500 or 600 across most of the coastal bend in South Texas. And so not only is that somewhat of a concern for fire weather, although for the most part vegetation is doing very well, this does show that top layer of soil is starting to dry out. And actually the worst locations are over in East Texas. Interestingly enough, we have started to see some smaller scale wildfires over in East Texas recently. And typically that's your more pine wooded areas and stuff like that versus grassland. And so but it's interesting where those higher values are, we've started to see some fire activity. And these are the burn bans. I think Matagorda was added after I did this map, but generally speaking, it's kind of hit or miss in South Texas and the coastal bend. Some counties have burn bans in place, others don't. while the vegetation is still decent, one thing we are having is some pretty gusty south winds. And even though the humidity is staying up in the afternoon, those south winds, 20, 25 miles an hour, if a fire were to get started, it could spread in some of the fuels that are out there, especially back along the Rio Grande Plains, where the vegetation is not quite as green as some of the other areas. All right, so let's talk about sea surface temperatures for a minute. I'm going to talk a lot about this through this presentation. So this was January of this year, and a couple of things stand out. One is the tremendous warmth that we always have been talking about in the oceans. The Atlantic, look at that, it's very warm. The North Pacific, Central Pacific is very warm. And then you have this kind of bluish cool water here in the Central Pacific, the Equatorial Pacific, south of Hawaii, over to the coast of South America. That was our La Nina that we've been talking about for the last 3 years. Kind of unusual to see back to back to back La Nina 3 years in a row, but that's what's happened. And that's sort of what has led in a large part to the dryness in the southern plains in Texas over the last several years. So this was January. You can kind of see maybe some warm water starting to take shape there off the coast of South America. And then we're going to fast forward to June, so a 6-month period, and we have completely eliminated La Nina altogether and replaced it with very warm conditions off the coast of South America and a developing now onset El Nino. And so in a 6-month period, we went from below normal water temperatures to above normal water temperatures here in the equatorial Eastern Pacific. And that is, when you talk about warming water, especially to the degree that it has warmed, we're talking 1 to 2 degrees of warming over a 6-month period. That's a lot of energy that is being put into the Eastern Pacific Ocean water. And so eventually there is going to be an atmospheric response to this, as we typically see. Of course, you can look back here at the Atlantic, very, very warm in the Atlantic also, especially the northern Atlantic off the European coast, and the eastern Atlantic off of the African coast, and then back kind of west toward the Caribbean. We'll talk more about that with respect to the hurricane season. But as you can see, still the patterns generally are showing up here of very warm ocean conditions across a large portion of the world. And so this is the typical response to El Nino and La Nina. And in South Texas, Southern Plains, we really see the effects of what is happening in the Eastern Pacific in our what we call our cool season months. So this is maybe starting as early as September and then lasting through March or April, maybe even into May of the following year. So that is the period of time where we generally see the impacts or the effects of the El Nino and La Nina condition in the Eastern Pacific. And so we really don't see a lot of that in our summer months. So typically our summer months are driven by generally the tropics, what comes out of the tropics, tropical waves, tropical depressions, tropical storms, hurricanes, stuff like that come out of the Gulf of Mexico. And that's where the majority of our rainfall comes in the summertime, especially right along the coast. As you move inland, you really don't get a lot of rain in the summertime back in the Rio Grande Plains up into the other parts of inland Texas. But this is the typical response we get in those cold season months. The typical La Nina, what we've been in the last few years, drier and warmer than normal. We've certainly been having that. And then what we're pretty confident in going in towards this fall and winter is El Nino conditions persisting and a cooler and wetter. And, it says colder on here. And I think when we start talking about what does colder mean, that doesn't mean freezes, it doesn't mean we're going to get down in the teens and 20s, but below normal temperatures, because we get a lot of clouds in an El Nino type winter. We have a lot of days that are cloudy and drizzly and light rain and foggy. And so you could have a low of 42 and a high of 46, a lot of those types of days, which lead to below normal temperatures versus what we've seen the last several winters where you have a lot of sun, not a lot of clouds. So you can have a low in the 30s and still warm up to 75 in the afternoon. And so that typically averages out to an above average temperature in La Nina. So that's kind of what we're thinking for this winter. We'll get more into that toward the end of the year when we have more confidence in how the El Nino developing out there is going to couple with the atmosphere. But generally speaking, that's what we're probably looking for. And you can see here the Niña regions with the rapid warming again. If you look at January, well below normal water temperatures in all the regions to now well above water temperatures in all the regions. So rapid onset of what has happened out in the Pacific. And this is the kind of the forecast that takes us, through the rest of the summer, into the fall, into the winter, and even into next spring. And you can see, most of these climate or these models here are taking us up towards about 1 to 1.5 degrees of warming across the El Nino regions. And right now we're hovering right around 1 degree. So maybe another half a degree of warming. There was very significant, very quick warming in May and June, and then it's kind of leveled off now. So we'll see if that returns and we continue to warm, and we go into a really strong El Nino, or if we just kind of hover around that 1 degree above normal. But we'll also, just because the water's warm in the Eastern Pacific and the Central Pacific, we'll have to see how that couples with the atmosphere. One of the things I'm sort of surprised with so far is with so much warmth out there, there hasn't been a lot of Eastern Pacific hurricane activity. And so you would think with all that warm water and generally somewhat favorable conditions in the Eastern Pacific, we'd be cranking out tropical storms and hurricanes. And so far that hasn't really happened. We'll see if that changes as we go into the fall months. And we get more hurricane activity off the coast of Mexico. That potentially is something we pay attention to in Texas as you start to get into October and November for sure. As fronts begin to come down, they can capture sometimes those tropical storms and hurricanes, turn them back into the coast of Mexico, and bring all that moisture up across Texas. And we can get some big heavy rain and potential flooding from those types of setups. So it's something we're going to keep an eye on. That tends to happen in El Nino years as we get into the fall months. And so we'll see if the Eastern Pacific finally begins to produce the tropical storms and hurricanes with such warm water. So this is the outlook going into the rest of July and then on into September. And you can see, interestingly enough, there's a fairly dry signal, if you will, across Texas, kind of near normal precipitation to below normal rainfall as we get down towards the coast. Now, remember, July is kind of one of our drier months. And then as we start to get into September and October, our rainfall increases. Our normal rainfall increases in these areas. And so by the time you get to October is about as wet in some areas as it is in May. And so when we're talking below normal rainfall, we're still looking at the potential for rainfall. It's just might not be the 4 or 5 or 6 inches some areas typically get in the month of October. And so we'll see. I think a lot of this is focused around the later part of this period and not so much the front end of it. But we'll see. This is that was the US model, the CVS model. And then we have the European, and it does not show quite as much of a dry signal in Texas. It has a bigger dry signal out in the southwest, which makes sense. That's where the core of this rigid high pressure is kind of setting up this summer. New Mexico, Arizona, West Texas. And so obviously dry out there, not a lot of monsoon moisture for those areas like they typically see. And then kind of near normal precipitation here in Texas and the coastal bend. And then the Canadian kind of has a different look. And I kind of took a deeper look into this, especially down in Mexico, of what exactly could be causing this. And at first thought I was like, maybe this is Eastern Pacific tropical systems turning back north and coming up across Mexico. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And so I don't know if this is a function of maybe some tropical wave activity in the Atlantic that generally would be south of Texas and going into northern central Mexico, and maybe South Texas would be on the northern edge of that. That could be what this is. But it didn't appear to be to me Eastern Pacific storms, and typically Eastern Pacific storms a little bit further north than what we're showing here. And again, this is quite a contrast from what you saw from the European and also the American. And this model is also not quite as dry in the Southwest United States. And so it may have a little bit of a wet bias here down in areas. And so this is the average of all of that put together. And so you can see You kind of average out the drier American and the wetter and the wetter Canadian. You kind of get this average of near normal precipitation, especially north of deep South Texas. And again, the kind of wet signal showing up south of that into Mexico. Again, I think that's potentially tropical wave activity, and that's great, wonderful. The tropical waves going south of us. If we're on the northern end of that, that can lead to an enhancement of the sea breeze and those summer type showers and thunderstorms that they start near the coast and move inland. For that to happen, we would really need that high pressure ridge that is pretty close to us now to shift to the north a little bit. And that may be some of these indications as we get into August and September, that high shifts a little bit to the north and puts us under more favorable easterly flow aloft that allows those tropical waves to come up a little bit further north and enhances that rainfall pattern, especially across deep South Texas. And so, there's not a strong signal here either way. So, the best course of action probably is near normal precipitation through the rest of our summer months. And that's generally what the NOAA forecast is. They continue to indicate above average precipitation in the plains. That has been a very favored location for heavy rains this summer so far, with the big high sitting up over the southwest. These complexes of storms kind of roll around the eastern and northern sides of this high. They may be a little aggressive here, showing that as far south as it is down into North Texas, but certainly areas of Kansas and Oklahoma into Arkansas, maybe even a little bit further east, have been kind of under the gun this summer for persistent rounds of showers and thunderstorms, kind of missing us off to the north and the east. And I think that's going to continue as long as that high continues out over the southwest US. The temperature profiles, it's warm. It's been warm. It continues to be warm. So this is the American, showing above average temperatures, nothing too crazy. Interestingly enough, as warm as it's been. And like I kind of talked about, these are actual temperatures. And so when you actually look at the temperatures, it's not overly hot. The heat index has been hot, but the temperatures themselves have not been overly hot. And that's kind of what this continues to show. It's going to be hot, it's going to be warm, but it's not, it's not like we're 110 degrees in the afternoon hours. And so above average, the European above average, especially in the southern United States. And the same thing with the Canadian, probably not as extreme on the Canadian. Interestingly enough, that wet signal does show up also in the Canadian down in South Texas. And so it kind of mutes those temperatures a little bit, if you will, because of the rainfall potential. And then the average here, nothing super extreme. You can kind of maybe pick out some higher values there in Oklahoma, North Texas. But the average here is for near normal temperatures or above normal down in the coastal areas of Texas as we go into our fall months. And generally speaking, the seasonal outlook from NOAA is probably a little bit more on the high side compared to what the models are showing. And you can see above average, the probability of above average temperatures 50, 60, 70% across most of South Texas through the remainder of the summer. And that's not surprising considering where we're at. This is the drought outlook from NOAA, and you can see we still have drought conditions in place in Central Texas and West Texas. And they do show drought development increasingly likely across the area that we are talking about. So the Rio Grande Plain, South Texas, Coastal Bend. We'll see. We kind of saw with those drought outlooks, drought is starting to creep back in. And this is really a function of it's hot, it's windy, and we're not getting a lot of rainfall. And so obviously, if that pattern continues for the next 2 weeks, we're going to see more locations get drier and drier. But again, this is not the type of period or season where we really see that big ridge of high pressure sitting up directly over Texas. And so small variations and movements of this high can allow some precipitation to sneak in, especially probably further to the south, down in deep South Texas, and then maybe up towards the Corpus Christi area. We'll just have to see how it kind of transpires as we get into, August. And, I think you look at this and you're like, oh boy, here come the drought's coming back, and I'd probably tap the brakes a little bit, and there's probably going to be some dryness, and we may get into some drought conditions, but it's not the level that we were in last year, and certainly not what we've seen in some of the other years. And so, while this is suggesting that, I think we're in a pretty decent spot with respect to where we've gotten those rains. Really were beneficial for us in May and June to help prevent very significant drought conditions from developing this summer. It kind of put us in a good spot to deal with some of the stuff we've had to deal with the temperatures and the heat. So this is the outlook. We do have an intensifying El Nino in the Pacific. That's probably going to play an increasingly bigger role in our weather as we get into the fall and winter months. So again, we'll talk more about that later this year. I would say near normal rainfall, especially near the coastal plain. If you go inland from the coastal plain, and what I mean by coastal plain, the coastal counties, maybe a row of counties inland from that or two. Further to the west and north, the rainfall will probably be near normal, maybe even a little bit below average. Temperatures above normal, we've seen that trend continues. In near average or slightly below average on the soil moisture, it just depends. Some places are in really good shape if you had rainfall. Some places had 4 or 5 inches of rain last week. Those places are in really good shape. Other places that have not seen the rainfall, those soil moisture profiles are going to continue to deplete probably pretty quickly, given the state we're in with the high temperatures, a lot of sun, and gusty winds. That's going to really draw that moisture out of the soil pretty quickly. But vegetation health is still doing pretty good in most areas. So while we'll see some degradation of that over time, we're doing better than we have been in a lot of cases. All right, so we'll take a look at the hurricane season outlook. So hurricane season started on June the 1st, goes through the end of November. For Texas, it's really the first part of the season from June through about mid-October. There's not a whole lot of impacts in the state of Texas after mid-October. And so generally speaking, our season is kind of what we call front loaded. So we really have to pay attention as soon as June. Our big time of the year here is mostly August and September, and then it kind of drops off pretty quick. So this was last year. So we had 14 named storms last year, right about average in the Atlantic Basin. The northwestern, western Gulf, northern Gulf, very quiet. We did not have any impacts in those portions of the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at the map here, we almost made it through the season with no significant U.S. impacts until the last part of September. We had the major Hurricane Ian make landfall in Southwest Florida. That was a very high-end Category 4, relatively large storm, produced a really big storm surge down in the Fort Myers Beach area, further south towards Captiva Island, and those areas. Devastating storm surge in those areas. And then we also had a very late season Hurricane Nicole, November 7th through 11th, which made landfall on the east coast of Florida. Not the latest. The latest hurricane to make landfall in the United States, Hurricane Kate, back in 1986, which was a Category 2 across the Florida Keys around the week of Thanksgiving. So we can still get storms in November. They tend to be Florida storms, maybe up the U.S. East Coast. But it'd be very rare to get something in the northwestern Gulf of Mexico in late November or November period. So we talked about sea surface temperatures. You can see the same anomalies here, the same map. The Atlantic, very warm water, especially what we look at this time of year is that the area between Africa and the Caribbean. You see those water temperatures are running above average. So above average water temperatures does a couple things. One, it lowers the background sea level pressure, and it produces more favorable conditions for showers and thunderstorms to develop. And so obviously showers and thunderstorms developing eventually leads to potentially low pressure developing and a tropical system developing. And then once that tropical system forms, it's able to feed or intensify on those warm waters a lot easier. And so the warm water is a really important factor. But at the same time, we have this developing El Nino in the Eastern Pacific. And El Nino tends to produce a lot of wind shear across the southern Gulf of Mexico, especially the Caribbean, and then somewhat to a degree out into the Atlantic. And so even though we have the warm water, we have this competing atmospheric response, if you will, from El Nino that tends to reduce Atlantic basin hurricane activity. And so there's this great pull right now. There's this great debate or divide between the warm water temperatures in the Atlantic, which are very, very warm, some of the warmest we've ever seen, and this El Nino, and kind of which one is going to win out. Is the warm water is going to be enough that it's able to build enough high pressure over the Atlantic to kind of keep that negative wind shear at bay? Is the negative wind shear just focused in one portion of the basin, say the Caribbean, and the rest of the basin is generally favorable for development? That's a potential also. And so the numbers, the season outlooks we're kind of looking. We were initially early in May and June. This probably is going to be a below average season. El Nino's coming on strong. Yeah, the Atlantic's warm, but wind shear, you can have warm water, but if the atmosphere is not right, it's warm water. We do that all the time in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico is always hot, but we don't always have hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. And so there's kind of this competing sources, if you will, and slowly but surely we've seen the numbers kind of creep up. The European model is very, very aggressive. It's forecasting 18, 19 named storms this year, even with a strong El Nino. And so it's a very odd pull of what we know and what we have seen in the past and what's happening. And then all of a sudden, these models are coming out with a very active hurricane season, even with the El Nino in place. And so it's going to be very interesting. And I'll say right now, I don't have a lot of confidence, and I typically don't have a lot of confidence in seasonal outlooks, anyways. But I don't have a lot of confidence at all in this one this year. And you can see this pattern. This is sort of an El Nino pattern. You can see that dryness in the Caribbean. So this is precipitation. And for seasonal hurricane stuff, you want to look at precipitation anomalies. You want to look at where's the models and forecasting above normal precipitation. And you can see there's a big signal here, and this signal has been here and it's sort of gotten wetter and wetter over time, from the coast of Africa and then kind of toward the Northeast Caribbean, and then maybe angling up toward the Bahamas and Florida. So, could this mean this is tropical storms and hurricanes? Absolutely. Is this tropical waves? It could be, just a train of tropical waves, one after another, that just produces showers and thunderstorms. And so the models keying back in, yeah, the precipitation is going to be above average. But what you typically see in the summer months in this area is that this is a signal for tropical storms and hurricanes. And it's a little bit further to the north. And you kind of see that dryness pattern there from Central America through South America, and then out into the Atlantic south of that wet signal and across the Caribbean. And that's a very typical El Nino type pattern. So, if you look at this, my thing is, yeah, we could get tropical storms and hurricanes quickly in the East Atlantic, the Central Atlantic, but maybe not making it that far west, because the signal does not say continue into the Gulf of Mexico very clearly. You kind of have a near normal signal in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, looking at this, if I were in Florida, the Southeast United States, maybe the East Coast of the United States, I'd be a little bit concerned at this point. I'd be paying attention. Further west in the Gulf of Mexico is a little bit more, there's not a strong signal here. We know El Nino tends to produce wind shear in the southern Gulf of Mexico, maybe not so much in the northern Gulf. But this pattern is setting up is not necessarily you're going to get Atlantic hurricanes to the Gulf of Mexico. Our most favored pattern is something coming through the Caribbean and then coming up into the Gulf. And this is not what this is showing here. This is showing, if anything, most things passing north of the Caribbean. And it's very hard anyways to get stuff that forms off the coast of Africa this far west to Texas. And so it really looks like a season that if Texas were to be threatened by something, it would be something that develops in the Gulf of Mexico, either close to our coast or off the Louisiana coast or off the Florida Panhandle coast. And what's interesting about that is, given that high pressure cell sitting up somewhere over the Four Corners or West Texas, that produces a similar downstream response over the central eastern Gulf of Mexico of lower pressures. And so as we get into August, September, these complexes of storms that we're seeing in the plains that are moving off the Mississippi, Alabama coast, they could get out over the Gulf waters and try to form low pressure. And there's a historical correlation there that some of these things can develop into tropical systems. And depending on where the high is, they can move back west towards Texas, or they can be pulled up north and east into the southeast US or off the southeast US coast. And so if we're probably going to see anything in the Gulf of Mexico, my thought is it's coming, probably developing in the Gulf. Would I completely rule out a tropical storm or hurricane coming out of the Atlantic or the Caribbean? I wouldn't. This is an average, and so there's always going to be a period in here, 5 or 10 days where things could be favorable in the Caribbean. And if you get the tropical wave in the right spot at the right time, it could go, and then it could move up into the Gulf of Mexico. And so, while that's a possibility, I think it's a lower possibility this year. And we've already talked about El Nino, with El Nino coming on and continuing to be strong. This should produce the wind shear aspects that we talked about, Southern Gulf and the Caribbean, and at least in those areas, keep the activity down. And these are the analog years, and I've played with the numbers a little bit. Colorado State came out, I think it was last week, and increased their numbers to 18. The official NOAA numbers are a little bit lower than that, but we've already had 3 named storms this year. So we're expecting an additional anywhere from 12 to 14 or 15 named storms, which is a lot. That would be a very active season for the Atlantic Basin. 6 to 8 hurricanes. We have not had a hurricane yet, and 2 to 4 major hurricanes. That's a category 3 or higher. And you can see the analog years here listed over on the left, and what we had in the state of Texas. Analog years are just kind of similar to what we're seeing now, although there's really not a lot of years where you can put together the extreme warmth of the Atlantic and a developing El Nino. And actually, a lot of the similarities are back in the late 1800s. And you got to kind of question, when you get back that far, how accurate is water temperatures? How well was this stuff really captured? Are we really looking at something similar to 1888 or 1885 or whatever? And so, we kind of go with more recent analogs, and they're not really great fits for what we're seeing out there. But the map also kind of shows the frequency in these particular years of where tropical storms and hurricanes have tracked. And if you notice, what's interesting, the warmer colors are the more frequent tracks. It almost matches that precipitation map that I showed a couple slides ago pretty well, especially across the central eastern Atlantic, and then they're off the southeast United States coast. Not so much in the Gulf of Mexico, relatively quiet in the Gulf and the Caribbean, and that would be a very typical El Nino response. And so if I had to guess, and this is really what it is at this point, is a guess, I think we're going to see, we could get up in the numbers. We could definitely get up 14, 15, 16 named storms, but they may be all out in the Atlantic, forming off the coast of Africa and then turning north and really staying out to sea. And then we'll have to see, does, Bahamas, Florida, Southeast US, is that something where something can kind of sneak further to the west and get close? And then, of course, does something develop in the Gulf of Mexico? So that's kind of the thinking this year. I wouldn't say, oh, hey, we're out of the woods. Nothing's going to happen in Texas, because obviously you never see that in hurricane season. As soon as you say that, you're going to get a storm. But I think our chances are probably a little bit lower than what they would normally be for impacts here, especially from deep tropical storms and hurricanes, the ones that form out well out into the Atlantic. Could we get some stuff forming up near the coast? Yeah, I mean, if the tropical wave last week, it looked very healthy out there south of Brownsville. If it had more time and sat over the Gulf for another day or two, it could have easily formed into a named storm and moved inland and produced a lot more rainfall. But it just wasn't able, it didn't have the time to sit out there and do that. And so that type of pattern, if we see that type of pattern as we get into August and September, where these tropical waves can get up in the western or northwestern Gulf and kind of fester for a couple of days, that would be the type of pattern that could produce a tropical storm or even a hurricane near the coast that could impact us. And so we'll see how that all plays out this year, but it'll be interesting to see how the numbers all add up at the end of the year and where we are, because there's really significant competing factors between what could be a really busy season or what could really be a relatively not busy season in the Atlantic, depending on which one of those factors, the sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic or El Nino in the Pacific, is more dominant. And really we'll have to see how it plays out. So with that, I'll take any questions we have about anything we've discussed, or anything else y'all want to chat about.